Emil Cioran wrote more pages justifying suicide than most philosophers write in defense of life. He lived to be 84. This video traces a single paradox through the life of a man who made an art form out of despair. Why does the philosopher most convinced that existence is unbearable choose every morning to endure it? Two questions will haunt what follows. First, is lucidity a form of cowardice disguised as courage? Second, can language become the only argument against suicide, even as it dismantles every reason to go on? Cioran was born in 1911 in a Romanian village at the edge of the Carpathian Mountains. His father was an Orthodox priest. By the time he was 20, he had stopped sleeping. Insomnia became the formative experience of his intellectual life. Awake through the night, he watched consciousness become a prison with no warden, no sentence, no appeal. He would later write, "Consciousness is much more than the thorn. It is the dagger in the flesh. To be awake at 3 in the morning is to be awake to the fact that being awake is the only real problem." What does it mean to spend years in a state where thought has no off switch, where every distraction fails, and you are left alone with the fact of your own existence? In Bucharest, he joined a generation of Romanian intellectuals electrified by mysticism, irrationalism, and the seduction of fascism. Cioran flirted with all three. He would spend the rest of his life trying to forget it. In 1937, he moved to Paris on a scholarship. He never left. He renounced Romanian and began writing in French, a language he described as a straitjacket that prevented him from saying anything too wild. The move was an exile, but also an erasure. In Paris, he lived in poverty, in a 6th-floor attic room with no heat. He remained there for 40 years. He wrote in cafes, on park benches, in libraries. He had no job, no academic position, no institutional affiliation. He refused every award offered to him. Consider what this posture means. To refuse recognition is not humility. It is a kind of aristocratic contempt for the very game others take seriously. But there is something else. To have no position, no title, no fixed identity is to reserve the right to contradict yourself. And Cioran contradicted himself constantly. He once said that only optimists commit suicide. Optimists who no longer succeed at being optimists. The rest of us, having no reason to live, have no reason to die. What does it mean to find in hopelessness a reason not to act? Is this wisdom or paralysis? His early books were written in Romanian, explosive and ecstatic. They read like mystical rants, full of fury and longing. After Paris, his style changed. French forced him into clarity. The aphorism became his form, a single thought stripped to its bone, refusing elaboration. An aphorism is a trap. It seduces you with its elegance, then leaves you with a wound you cannot close. Cioran's books do not argue. They accumulate. Page after page of fragments that circle the same obsessions: decay, consciousness, futility, death. You cannot summarize them because there is no system to extract. There is only a voice, returning again and again to the same abyss, refusing to look away. Why write at all if you believe words change nothing? Why not remain silent, like the mystics he admired? He admitted this himself. I write to forget, but the act of writing only sharpens the memory. The wound stays open because I keep touching it. Writing for Cioran was not therapy. It was a compulsion, not a cure for despair, but despair's most articulate form. He once said that every book he wrote was a postponed suicide. The question then is whether the postponement is indefinite or merely long. Ask yourself, if writing is the alternative to dying, what happens when you finish the book? Cioran never finished. He published book after book, each one a variation on the same theme. He was less a philosopher than a man conducting an experiment on himself. The experiment, How long can you think about death without dying? How much lucidity can one consciousness endure? He claimed that thinking was his only vice. Not drinking, not sex, not ambition. Just the habit of reflection which he could not break and which slowly poisoned him. But there is pleasure in poison, isn't there? The pleasure of knowing what others cannot bear to see. Cioran read the mystics, the pessimists, the prophets of decline. He loved St. John of the Cross, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. But he loved them the way a connoisseur loves rare disaster. He was not looking for answers. He was looking for company in the abyss. Language became his only consolation, not because it expressed what he felt, but because it failed so beautifully. Every sentence he wrote was an attempt to say the unsayable. Every failure proved that the attempt was worth making again. In 1937, the same year he arrived in Paris, Cioran wrote a short text titled On the Heights of Despair. It contains a sentence that would define his entire life. It is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late. What does this mean? That the moment you decide to die, you have already outlived the decision. The self that wanted death is already gone. Suicide, for Cioran, was not a solution. It was a horizon, always visible, never reached. He kept a supply of sleeping pills in his apartment. He never used them. He said their presence was enough. The option held open made life bearable. Consider what this reveals. It is not the act of dying that consoles, but the knowledge that you could. Freedom for Cioran was the freedom to refuse existence, a freedom he exercised by not exercising. Is this courage or cowardice? He himself did not know. He wrote, "I have decided not to decide, and this non-decision is the only decision that has ever felt honest." There is something unbearably modern in this. The paralysis of the over-examined life. The inability to act because every action has been thought to death. What if lucidity is not a gift, but a curse? What if seeing clearly only reveals that there is nothing to see? Cioran believed that the only honest response to existence was nausea. Not despair, not rage. Just a sick feeling in the stomach that never quite goes away. He lived with that nausea for 84 years. Every morning he woke up, and every morning he chose not to end it. Why? He gave many answers over the years, none of them satisfied. Laziness, vanity, neuronity, curiosity about what fresh horror tomorrow might bring. But perhaps the real answer is simpler. Perhaps he kept living because writing about death was more interesting than experiencing it. There is a pleasure in despair that no one talks about. Not the pleasure of resolution, but the pleasure of refinement. Cioran was a connoisseur of his own suffering. He returned to it the way a sommelier returns to a complex vintage, searching for notes he had missed the first time. This is what we miss when we call him a pessimist. Pessimism implies a verdict. Cioran was not interested in verdicts. He was interested in textures. What does despair feel like on a Tuesday morning in spring? What flavor does futility take when you are 20 versus when you are 60? He was conducting field research on consciousness itself. The fact that the research led nowhere was not a failure. It was the finding. Ask yourself, what if the point of thinking is not to arrive somewhere, but to intensify the experience of being lost? Cioran once admitted that he envied people who could believe in something. But the admission itself was insincere. He did not want to believe. He wanted to want to believe. There is a vanity in this, a pride in being the one who sees through everything. The lucid man as tragic hero. But what if lucidity is not courage? What if it is just another addiction? another way of refusing to participate in life. Cioran never married, had no children, no career, no political commitment. He floated above history like a man observing a war from a hot air balloon. Safe, distant, uninvolved. He claimed that consciousness was the dagger in the flesh, but he never dropped the dagger. He held it, turned it, admired the way the light caught the blade. This is the second question we began with. Can language become the only argument against suicide, even as it dismantles every reason to go on? For Cioran, yes. Yeah, language was the game worth playing precisely because it could never be won. He wrote, "The fact that life has no meaning is a reason to live. Moreover, the only one." What does this mean? That meaning is not discovered but invented. And invention requires time. So we continue. Or perhaps it means nothing. Perhaps it was just another beautiful sentence, and beauty was enough. In his final years, Cioran developed Alzheimer's. The man who had spent his life thinking could no longer think. He had written that consciousness was a curse. Now the curse was lifted. What remained was not peace, but erasure. He died in 1995. He had outlived his reasons for living and his reasons for dying. In the end, neither mattered. We began with two questions. The first, is lucidity a form of cowardice disguised as courage? Cioran spent his life seeing clearly and doing nothing. He called this honesty. But honesty that leads nowhere is indistinguishable from paralysis. The second question, can language become the only argument against suicide, even as it dismantles every reason to go on? For Cioran, language was the addiction that kept him alive, not because it offered hope, but because it offered a game complex enough to distract from the void. He was not a pessimist. He was an addict, and the substance he could not quit was the act of articulating why nothing matters. Perhaps that is all any of us are doing, finding elegant ways to postpone the question we cannot answer. Cioran turned his hourglass for 84 years. The sand never ran because he kept turning it over.